Right, so you might have been picking up on clues throughout the last few lectures, but many major public buildings in the 1800s, mostly in France, but also in America and the rest of Europe, had come to be built by graduates of the top art and architecture school then in the world, the School of the Beaux-Arts in Paris. The professors from this school influenced the students, Henry Hobson Richardson among them, and so held the world of Western architecture in their grip through nearly an entire century, and this largely explains why throughout the 1800s, historical revival movements dominated the Western world. It was what the professors taught as the most beautiful and worthy to be emulated, the classical and the Renaissance, the Gothic and the Romanesque. Its philosophy largely influences why many of us favor architecture with historical references to this day, as opposed to more modern movements which strove to break from depending on the formulas of the past to find beauty. Initially, many schools with the name Beaux-Arts, which means beautiful arts in French, existed around France since the late 1600s and always taught the principles of classical art and architecture, favoring classical and Renaissance facades, symmetrical compositions, and rational layouts like any architecture school of its time. For centuries, the basis of fine art had been drawing and copying from ancient buildings or old Renaissance masters. But as the 1800s progressed, architects began more and more to encourage other revivals such as the Gothic and the Romanesque. Felix Duban in Paris early on read where the wind of architecture was blowing and strove to refound his Beaux-Arts school in Paris as a catch-all historical revival academy. He began to rebuild the school in 1832, which had been a repurposed 17th century convent with a church and cloister. He demolished much of the old framework and reorganized the complex while adding many new buildings in neoclassical and Renaissance styles. As a strong supporter and inspirer of the new post-revolution regime, Duban was able to borrow large amounts of government funding to build a massive study museum where he could house collections of classical, Renaissance, and Gothic art and architectural fragments and a library. He had designed a palace imitating the rustic Renaissance palaces of Venice, with open galleries overlooking a large central courtyard. Duban stocked the courtyard in corridors with fragments of historical architecture and Renaissance paintings and sculptures to be studied by the students, and eventually covered it with a fair vitreous vault in 1867. Duban designed the hallways with multiple fresco painting styles throughout history, and the stairwells with samples of differing decoration styles in stone and marble. He lined the old convent cloister arcades with architectural fragments in chronological order in order to create an open-air museum. For the rest of the campus buildings, Duban continued to blend constructions from differing periods and to plaster spoils of historical architectural fragments all over the walls, creating a Frankenstein vision of architectural history, mostly consisting of distinguished examples of the classical, Renaissance, Gothic, and Romanesque. It was an ideal opportunity to provide educational examples to show students that the history of architecture wasn't confined to just antiquity and the Italian Renaissance. Duban had built a romantic dream campus for his architects, painters, and sculptors, fueled by the idea that modern art is the production of the evolution of the past. It was a new idea to use the past as a launching pad for new forms of architecture, rather than as a reference for replication. Duban's legacy in creating this school launched it quickly to international fame. Duban's students by the mid to late 1800s were encouraged to mix the most admired motifs of the past into single buildings and encouraged to use profuse decoration, effectively creating a new academically inspired eclectic architecture. Many students of the Paris Beaux-Arts School after Henry Hobson Richardson were truly eclectic, amalgamating many elements from different styles into their buildings in an attempt to create something signature and new while attempting to fit them into historic cities. It was the first break against the architectural conservatism of the past. The Paris Beaux-Arts School taught that students should attempt to combine the best of everything, and critics dubbed it the Beaux-Arts style. It often led to awkward hybrids, but also to works of great beauty that defined the post-Romantic era in Europe and Gilded Age America. So the eclecticism of the Beaux-Arts graduates led to creative combinations rather than these strict historical revivals. The Envaudoyer created one of the first radical combinations of several historical styles in the Cathedral of Marseille, built from 1852 to 1893. It combined the best of Romanesque Renaissance, and Byzantine and Islamic architecture to create something new. It was one of the largest cathedrals built in France since the Middle Ages, comparable in size to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The original cathedral in Marseille, known as St. Laurent Church, was located in the same spot where the current cathedral stands today. However, the St. Laurent Church was considered too small and outdated, and in the early 19th century, plans were made to demolish the old church and build a new, grander cathedral in its place. The architecture of the cathedral was designed to reflect the port city's multicultural reputation. It deliberately combines Eastern and Western styles of religious architecture. The outside is decorated with polychrome bands of green and white marble, which, in one sense, recalls the Italian Renaissance tradition of polychrome marble facades. For example, at the Piazza Santa Maria Novella, the Santa Croce, and the Duomo, especially Siena Cathedral, all very familiar to the citizens of Marseille. On the other hand, the composition of the marble, horizontally banded into light and dark, was directly taken from 11th to 18th century mosques and palaces, where Islamic architects frequently used the block, an architectural technique originating in Syria involving alternating rows of light and dark stone. The central octagonal dome with its oculus is an inspired mixture between the Duomo in Florence and St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, domes done in the Western Renaissance tradition, while the other four are very distinctively in an Eastern Byzantine style, complete with Greek crosses or floating arcades. The towers flanking the Byzantine domes recall Islamic minarets or prayer towers, a much further Eastern tradition. Some would say that the classical ornateness of the Renaissance dome fits awkwardly with the surrounding, more archaic-looking Byzantine domes and Islamic minarets, but one could argue that only an architectural historian would recognize this. The layout of the cathedral derives from the typical Roman basilica form, a nave with aisles and repeating arcades terminating in an apse, mixed with the Byzantine domical church overhead with its repeating domes on pendentives held up by piers. Vaudoyer is especially inspired here by St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, the Western church copied from the Eastern Byzantine Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. The patterned marble arches which hold up these domes point to an ever further Eastern tradition, the patterned arches in high medieval mosques. Much of the westwork, however, pays homage to its region, designed in the typical high Romanesque style of southern France, with its repeating blind arcades and round arches within arches, while the outside of the nave again is copied from the outside of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. To some, the Cathedral of Marseille evokes a sense of disjointedness in its contradictory references to historical styles, while to others, it was the first attempt to bring together all of the best facets of religious architecture, creating a space truly worthy to glorify the divine and evoke a sense of spirituality like never before. Then the architect of the new Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Paris, begun in 1874, took creative eclecticism to a new extreme. Designed by Paul Abade, another graduate of the School of the Beaux-Arts in Paris, it was offered as a monument of atonement for the moral decline of the country since the French Revolution. A society of French bishops and philanthropists funded it because they believed that France had been justly punished for its sins by the defeat of the French army at Sedan. This expectedly sparked major controversy among leftists. They didn't believe that France had to do penance for a century of free speech, science, and emancipated reason. They believed it was a propaganda piece against the pure motives of the revolution. Abade's proposed plan, termed Neo-Romanesque Byzantine to oversimplify it, was chosen from 77 other proposals because this church would sit on one of the highest summits in Paris and overlook the entire city. Its dominant feature is this immense elongated ovoid cupola or dome surrounded by four smaller cupolas. The elongated domes are, in a sense, neoclassical and are inspired by the Washington, D.C. Capitol building with their ovoid forms and repeated arcades, while the form of the church is largely Neo-Byzantine and the decorative facade is largely Neo-Romanesque. The needle-like lanterns which crown them are, however, more derived from Islamic minarets than any Western lantern forms. The plan of the interior is a Greek cross with an altar in the center, modeled after Byzantine churches, while its repeating domes on pendentives, held up by strong piers, recall Byzantine domical churches. Its ambulatory at the eastern end of the church, however, recalls traditional Western French churches, and this is a signature of the French Romanesque and Gothic churches, where this was used for pilgrims to gain access to relics, and so throws the whole Byzantine cross form into confusion. The mosaic over the apse, the largest and more important work of art in the church, is deliberately designed after Byzantine apse mosaics. A good, well-preserved exemplar for this could have been the apse mosaic in the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. Christ dressed in white offers his golden heart with open arms, while flanked by ranking figures, foremost among them the Virgin Mary and the Archangel Michael. At his feet, St. Joan of Arc is kneeling, offering him a crown. Pope Leo XIII offers him a globe, symbolizing the world. To his right, a group of popes and cardinals present the model of the Basilica to Christ, and to his left, people in the costumes of 5 continents offer him homage. These are all themes which appear very frequently in Byzantine apse mosaics. In all of the mosaic, the artists adapted elements of Byzantine art in the organization of the figures, the altered perspective, and the use of polychrome colors enhanced with silver and gold. One of the most exuberant expressions of Beaux-Arts eclecticism and a defining monument of the style came about because of the delirious fantasies of Ludwig II of Bavaria. In 1866, Bavaria lost a devastating war with Prussia, and Ludwig lost his status as a sovereign ruler. He retreated to his familial lands and began the construction of a small fantasy kingdom where he could feel like a real king and win back his reputation. As you can imagine, he was one of the most enthusiastic sponsors of Beaux-Arts architecture in an age where historical styles gave credibility. Ludwig was a fanatic of Romantic literature and had a passion for operas set in the Romantic past, and would have liked to live in their worlds of luxurious illusions. So Ludwig hired Beaux-Arts architect George Dolman and hired him to build these 3 castles in an age where the function of castles had long since vanished, so he could live in these vague, historically inspired stage sets. Ludwig II spent much of his childhood in his father's castle in southern Bavaria, exploring the narrow mountain ranges as a child, and he picked his favorite childhood lookout spot to build his primary castle. This, his most ambitious castle, was set on a rugged hill. Building a castle perched on sheer cliffs was extremely difficult. This was compounded with an ever-changing taste for designs of the king, which forced his engineers to work sometimes 24-hour shifts. As the years went by, Ludwig withdrew from politics and strove to create a detached fantasy world around himself entirely. Neuschwanstein Castle would be his primary residence from 1884 until his death. His passion for Richard Wagner inspired much of his architectural vision. The end result was a turreted collage of Romanesque 13th century castle fortresses on a hill overlooking a waterfall. Ludwig wanted it to recall the romantic ideal of a medieval knight's castle. He was especially inspired by late medieval and Gothic revival castles for the form, and that of his father's nearby, but he chose to use Romanesque windows and entryways. So the building was furnished with numerous towers, ornamental turrets, gables, balconies, pinnacles, and sculptures. Following the Romanesque style, most window openings are fashioned as those bi- and triforia windows. But unlike real castles whose building stock was the result of centuries of building activity built for specific defense needs, Neuschwanstein was planned from the inception as an intentionally asymmetric building done in several different historical styles to make it look as if it was added to in different eras. For instance, the interior, and especially the throne room, reveals a unique blend of Byzantine and Arab construction and wall art, and many corridors abruptly change from the Gothic to rooms featuring Gothic furniture next to Romanesque or Byzantine and Arabian architecture. The bedroom walls are of course all covered with scenes from the operas of Wagner. The interior rooms were all designed around a secret cave system entered by secret doors into which Ludwig could escape when entertaining guests for moments of solitude before magically appearing in a new room. Ludwig himself wrote out his simple thinking for building a castle such as this. He said, "It is essential to create such paradises, such poetic sanctuaries where one can forget for a while the dreadful age in which we live." This castle impressed the world so much that decades later, Walt Disney would base his castle off of it. By the end of the 1800s, the Beaux-Arts style began losing support in Europe but gained massive popularity in the United States during the boom period known as the American Renaissance. The US began producing public buildings and mansions that imitated the scale of ancient Rome and supplied the rich with grand statements of their status. This was because by the end of the 19th century, the US produced over 1/3 of the world's industrial products. for cars, steamboats, trains, etc., and those families who controlled these big industrial businesses ushered in a new flourishing style of architectural patronage focused on the high life and flaunting wealth. Think the Great Gatsby era. In this effort to compensate for their lack of past, American industrialists hired Beaux-Arts trained architects to reproduce the glories of the old world of Europe. Richard Morris Hunt was the first American trained at the Beaux-Arts in the 1840s. He founded an architectural office in New York in 1857 where he introduced new unseen forms of architecture into America. His more mundane projects included French-inspired apartment buildings and museums, but his genius shone through the overly ostentatious and gaudy mansions that he designed. He was the favorite architect of the Vanderbilts, the then wealthiest family in the United States who virtually controlled the entire steamboat and railroad industry. For them he designed several mansions. The grandest was by far the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina, built throughout the 1880s. It rivals even the grandeur of Ludwig's castle. The scale and scholarship of this mansion demonstrated to white Americans that although America did not possess the heritage of Europe, it now had the resources to quickly stimulate it, and many industrialists dreamed of finally making America's architecture as rich and extravagant as Europe's finest cities, with architectural references to the past everywhere. They wanted to make America look like an ancient European country, even if only artificially. For many ways, it was wrapped up in the idea of manifest destiny. Their European ancestors won America, and so it was only natural to turn it into another Europe. For others, colleges of European architecture were simply associated with high-class and flashy displays of wealth in Europe, albeit now growing out of taste over there. American industrialists loved it precisely because it was going out of style across the ocean. It contained just the right hint of tastelessness that said, "I worked for my money, I didn't inherit it," that self-made aristocrat Americans loved. The Biltmore estate was designed to be the largest privately owned house in the United States and maintains that title today. The estate was built as a summer house in an area which the Vanderbilts used to frequent called their Little Mountain Escape. George Vanderbilt loved the landscape and the sweeping views and just had to build a house, gardens, and estate there. Hunt and Vanderbilt initially had a vision for a very small, tucked away in the mountains house retreat, but as they traveled in France and England, visiting great country estates, their vision grew. It would become their main home because of all the work they put into it. Hunt used lots of French Renaissance chateau estates as inspiration. This was the perfect style for a Beaux-Arts architect to play around with, already a blend of Baroque, Neoclassical, and Gothic styles, with their steeply pitched roofs, turrets, and sculptural ornamentation. Biltmore features carved Gothic decorations on prominent points, lookouts, and door jambs much more extensively than the traditional chateau estates, namely trefoils, flowing tracery, rosettes, and gargoyles. The three-story staircase is one of the most prominent features of the facade, with its high decorated winding balustrade featuring carved statues. Many of the interior rooms are done in differing styles. Many are Baroque. The greenhouse is Neo-Gothic. The Palace of Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, also a Vanderbilt estate house designed by Hunt, was another great experiment, this time done in a very academic Neo-Italian Renaissance architecture, with very diverse historically inspired interiors from room to room. It has a very unapologetic, over-the-top commitment to these historical styles, even if they have no utility, a very Beaux-Arts characteristic. There are rooms in the Baroque, the Rococo, and the Neoclassical, and every branch-off style in between. The billiards room, for instance, was designed in the style of a Republican-era ancient Roman villa with slabs of marble, alabaster arches, and mosaic artworks. The house never got old. Although it's committed to the classical forms, it features just about every variation of classical architecture and design. Going from room to room changes one's frame of mind. Many rooms are presided over by figures symbolizing virtues, a very ancient Greco-Italian architectural trait. For example, the hall features limestone figures celebrating personified versions of humanity's progress in art, Apollo, in science represented by Dante, and industry represented by Galileo, fitting idols for the Vanderbilt family. So we've got this idea of harkening back to the good old aristocratic decor and architecture of Europe that promotes the idea that the American industrialists are somehow the aesthetic descendants of European aristocrats going back to ancient Rome. So Richard Morris Hunt, from his office in New York, trained his assistants and effectively created a school of his own in America. One of his assistants, Frank Furness, pursued a new, unprecedented sense of individualism beyond the Beaux-Arts ideal. While grounded in the planning principles of his master, he explored the language of potentially unsettling historical hybrids. His design for the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts School, studio, and museum was initially inspired by Ruskin's drawings and depictions of medieval Venetian architecture, but came to unapologetically mix several conflicting historical styles. It housed 19th and 20th century American paintings, sculptures, and drawings, archives, important works in American history, and houses teaching studios and student studios. The building structure combines brick, stone, and iron because of fireproofing concerns. Many of the iron beams, especially on the roof, have been deliberately left uncovered. Furness's adoption of unapologetic steel industrial construction on the roof and also on the door lamps and internal stair railings suggest a new way forward for American architecture. This is a proposal for twisting industry with the best architectural motifs of the past, even further than the simple blending of historical revivals with ferrovitreous structures. The glazed, steel-framed roof with a raised ventilator provided lighting and advanced circulation for the upper-level galleries. The whole academy, in fact, was organized like the great factories of the region. First-floor studios feature glass roofs to maximize light and sit on massive exposed steel trusses, and an immense freight elevator from the studios to the gallery made possible the elevation of large sculptures and paintings from the main gallery level. So the Beaux-Arts reared its head one final time in America before the country began to lose taste of it. 7 Beaux-Arts firms joined together, including Richard Morris Hunt, under leading Beaux-Arts architect Daniel Burnham, to create a temporary mini-city for the World's Colombian Exposition in Chicago, held in 1893 in the swampland of Jackson Park just outside the city. It would be a city built on water, built around canals like Venice, which became the inspiration for the fairground. The World's Colombian Exposition was a World's Fair like those previously held in England and Paris. It was to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival to the New World in 1492, hence the name the Colombian Exposition. Remember how World's Fairs were occasions for Western countries to demonstrate how advanced they were to the world in terms of architecture, art, and industry. So at the fair, artists, musicians, and marvels of American industry and science were featured inside and outside of its buildings. The horticulture building, with its massive ferrovitreous dome, was claimed to hold every specimen of plant in the world. Some of the most popular exhibits were things that were the world's biggest, like the biggest lump of coal or the biggest telescope. It even featured the world's first Ferris wheel. The US had sent invitations to countries from around the world to send exhibits. A staggering 46 countries set up buildings or booths in their indigenous architecture and brought trade items and inventions from their countries to show off their unique resources. And every US state put up a building in the north end of the fairground. Displays were presented to show America as the center of the world trade and the center of industry, to show that America had made something of itself. It was also designed to generate profits to rebuild Chicago after the Great Fire of 1871 and promote the growing city to the world. To fund this massive fair, Congress got several industrialists on board by inciting a bidding war between holding it at New York and Chicago. It was built in just 2 years on a reclaimed swamp and opened for 6 months. The fair set the world record for outdoor attendance, drawing over 700,000 people on one day on October 9th, and in all drew in around 27 million people from all over the world. No crowd this size had ever before been assembled in the United States. In fact, it was the biggest World's Fair that had ever been held, then or since. Some of the greatest architects of the day were involved in building the exhibition buildings. The fair's centerpiece was dubbed by the press the White City, built in Jackson Park, a timber and plaster city built by Daniel Burnham and the 7 Beaux-Arts firms. It was primarily made of staff, a kind of stucco made from a mixture of plaster, cement, and fibers. The staff was laid over wood and steel frames to create the walls. What looked like shimmering marble at the fair was really just molded staff. In fact, spray paint, a hose connected to a vat and pressurized pump, was invented here to quickly paint the buildings. This was the prototype of what Burnham and his colleagues thought a public space in a city should be. They wanted to build the prototype of prototypes to inspire America to reimagine its cities, so you can see where America's architectural opinion was at this point. Gone were the days of cities centering around the courtyards of churches. American cities should recall ancient Rome, centered around forums and fountains, with self-righteous statues celebrating their history, with public spaces surrounded by temples dedicated to new American gods, the virtues of progress in industry, arts, and science, which is exactly what they did here. Cities should reflect America's progress, optimism, ambition, and delight in variety and discovery. Around the White City, there were all kinds of smaller cities built in many people's indigenous architecture. What's more, the White City served to show the world that Chicago had risen from the ashes of the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. It was designed to follow Beaux-Arts principles of design, namely neoclassical mixed with neo-Renaissance architecture and principles based on symmetry, balance, and overdone splendor. It was organized over a large water lagoon representing the voyage Columbus took to the New World, with replicas of his 3 ships inside. The grand neoclassical buildings of the White City were named as temples to industry and civilization. The administration building to the White City was a triumphal arch on top of what looked like a slightly smaller version of the US Capitol, only more Renaissance and slightly Rococo. Entering into this would have provided access to the Court of Honor, the official name for the White City. It consisted of 6 enormous blinding white classical buildings to house exhibition spaces surrounding a basin of water. At one end of the lagoon was a gilded statue symbolizing the American Republic, a robed woman 65 feet high, crowned with laurel leaves, held up an orb and staff, the traditional Roman symbols of sovereignty. On the orb, which represents the globe, sat an American eagle. Behind her on the east side of the White City was a portico of classical columns, with double rows of 48 columns representing the states and territories of the U.S., all supporting a roof lined with allegorical statues. On the top of the arch, a horse-pulled wagon symbolized the first explorers to America. The portico separated the fair from the waters of Lake Michigan, where boats could dock. At the other end of the lagoon was a domed temple to industry built by Richard Morris Hunt. The imagery of the White City recalled the grand public spaces of the Roman Empire. The facades evoked ancient splendor and held America up as the new Rome. But it was all a facade. The structures were hollow sheds of wrought iron frames covered with wood and plaster, painted white, occasionally with thin facings of stone. One building alone, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, was the largest building then in the world. The White City, however, sparked considerable controversy. Non-white cultures were largely excluded from the main park of the White City. The city, with its vision of future perfection and the advanced power of America, garnered criticism that's represented a white city not only in color but in race. People of color were barred entirely from participating in the White City and given access only to the peripheries, which specialized in spectacles of so-called barbarous races, where authentic villages of Samoans, Egyptians, Dahomeyans, and Turks and other peoples were populated by imported natives. Prizes of colonized nations were displayed as primitive, exotic artifacts to compare to the progress of the Western world. The fair became the first symbol of American exceptionalism, the belief that America is exemplary compared to all other nations. America's leading civil rights leaders wrote a pamphlet and circulated it around the grounds called "The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Colombian Exposition," which argued that the exposition organizers had deliberately excluded African Americans and other non-white races and nations from the White City in order to shame them and paint the White City as the pinnacle of white America and other races and colonized countries as subservient. Ultimately, the White City is credited for ushering in the City Beautiful movement. The highly integrated design of landscapes, promenades, and structures provided a vision of what was possible when planners and architects worked together on a comprehensive design. The millions of visitors who came to Chicago during the fair took home new ideas in commerce, industry, technology, and entertainment. Frank Lloyd Wright, a later architect that we're going to talk about, as a young man here later wrote that, "By this overwhelming rise of grandomania, I was confirmed in my fear that a native architecture would be set back at least 50 years.